Okay. So what we're going to do today is we're going to do an introduction to Maisa Bereshis and Maisa Merkava, which loosely translated it is the work of creation and the work of the chariot. And we're going to basically be using the text of Ein Darshan, chapter 2 of Chagiga, as the kind of springboard for this topic. Zev, at least in the Zoom, included in the chat the link to the Sefaria. Anybody who is on now, go ahead and if you don't have the Gemara, the Talmud with you, just open up the chat. It should start with Ein Darshan ba'arayot b'shlosha v'lo b'maisa bereshit b'shnayim v'lo b'merkava b'yachid el im ken haya chacham umevi midaito, which is talking about the limit that needs to be placed on who and how you teach these two esoteric teachings of Maisa Bereshis and Maisa Merkava. So everybody can find it. So here's what I'm going to do. What?
11a, you said?
Yeah. If you're following in the Talmud.
From the top?
It's close to the top.
Okay.
Yeah. Are you looking in an actual like physical Talmud, or are you looking in Sefaria?
I'm looking at Sefaria.
Okay. Well, there's a link in the chat if you have another device you could use, look in Sefaria. It's towards the top of 11a. So I want to first start out, before I actually read the section in the Talmud. It's actually not a very long section, but it's too much to do in one night. So what I'll do is I'll do certain selections of it, and maybe we'll do a part 2, which will just be hyper-focused on the actual story of the four who went, the most famous part of this section of the tractate is the four that entered into the Pardes. So I may do everything kind of around it, some of the things that lead up to it, maybe even some things that come after it. And then we'll do another session just on the story of what it means that they, the four, what happened to each one of them, why what happened, what they saw, what they didn't see. But in order to even get to that story, there's pages of Talmud before, there's some pages after, and I want to basically bring out five ways, but for bonus points, I've got 2 additional ways. So a total of 7 ways of how to understand what Maisa Bereshis and Maisa Merkava are. And whatever I tell you now, we're going to then look at the text and decide for ourselves which one we like. We like 1, we like 3, we like 5, we like 6, which 6, by the way, is none of the first 5 are right. I mean, we don't know what it is, basically. And number 7 is they're all right. So let's do the first 5. So the first is that there was a tradition, probably for the most part oral. It was never written down for the most part, and that's what we don't have it. Maybe we have snippets of it here and there that came into the Talmud, like some of this section in this tractate, and some other sections that made it into Brachot and Sanhedrin. Well, I'll give you a few examples later, that basically are teachings, esoteric teachings. And they're perhaps you could say magical. And I wouldn't necessarily say mystical in the mystical sense of what Jewish mysticism would turn into, but its own earlier form of mysticism that the closest thing that it could be kind of similar to would be Hechalot literature in some elements and agadic stories of the angel of death, various angels, and magical charms that are permeating the Talmud, and nobody knows what to do with. Most people just ignore it, including me. I love the stories, but then when it gets into like kind of this magical things about what to eat and how to go to the bathroom, I just tend to ignore that stuff. And most people halachically ignore many of the kind of magical elements of the Talmud, not always, but often. So that's the first way. And I'm going to show you the source for that way. The source for that way is basically a Rashi makes that claim in the 51st daf of Brachot. So I'll show that to you later. So that's the first way. The second way so there'll be a lot of problems with this way because the thing is, it seems like Merkava isn't just a bunch of rabbis learning, or a few rabbis, a select elite few, learning these kind of hidden teachings, brisos they're called, which are like a Mishnah, except that they weren't part of the Mishnah. It seems like there was this kind of mystical revelation that was very intense that would go along with it. And maybe the answer is that, yeah, it was some type of unique combination of these teachings that you would then use to manipulate the situation to go on these trips. That could very well be. But the emphasis is on you learn these things, and then when you learn them, whatever happens, happens, almost like subservient to the text, or they're not a written text per se, there would be a spoken text, a brisa. The second is it is Kabbalah Maisiot. It's not so much about a brisa, but it was forms of practical magic that still exist. It's called Kabbalah Maisiot. It's called the practical Kabbalah. And that's mentioned, for example, in Tosfos when he says Maaseh Bereshis, he says that's the mem base otiot, the first 42 letters of the first two verses of Bereshis are basically, like a divine name of some sort, and you'd use that to induce some state of whatever it is you were trying to induce. And likewise, the commentaries say the word itself, Maaseh Bereshis, Maaseh Merkava, means Maaseh, like Kabbalah Maisiot. It's the same thing. You could argue with that and say, well, Kabbalah Maisiot is a term that was coined much later and doesn't mean that that's what they meant. But that's the second way of learning it, that the Maaseh Bereshis and Maaseh Merkava are some forms of magic. Now, it may not be general magic. It may be particular magic. It may be related to ascending into heaven, either actually or as if. That's already debated about whether their ascent or descent actually means they flew somewhere, they went somewhere, or they just stayed in their seat, but it was as if they went. So that's an old argument. That's number two. Number three is its physics. The two most notable schools of its physics or metaphysics as an extension of physics are Maimonides and possibly, depending on how you read it, the Sefer Yetzirah, the early work of what we call Kabbalah now, that does seem to be very well aware of this section of Talmud, and also seems to be written in a way that you could understand it as some description of reality, such as the astronomy and astrology of the planets and stars, as well as the calendar. and description of time and space and things like that. Now, let's go back to Maimonides for a second. Maimonides is the easier one. Maimonides is very clear about this, as clear as he gets. Of course, nobody wrote as clearly as Maimonides and is so debated about what he meant, because there's a few things he wrote that shed a lot of mystery on everything, on his clarity. What does Maimonides say is Maaseh Bereshis and Maaseh Merkava? So in the third book of the Mar Nevuchim, of the Guide to the Perplexed, and in the first chapters of, particularly the first chapter of the Mishnah Torah, of Sefer Hamada, of Hilchos Deos, where it's basically beliefs, or beliefs is a word that Maimonides tends to go for. We're required to know, to study, to understand, because he believes it's not just beliefs. But in those areas and in other places, but particularly in those two areas, he explains that to basically understand the creator, you have to understand the creation. So you have to understand physics. So for example, you'd have to understand things like, how is it that we have all these stars, like the constellations, sun, the moon, how it is that those things work? You know, what's the power behind them? So one of the things Maimonides will posit is that, based on the idea that there are these spheres in heaven that are tremendously big, they're almost infinite. I mean, they're as big as we can imagine. And the only way those things would be able to move is if there was a source so powerful that it had infinite power. Today we have a slightly different explanation. I don't know how slightly different, some people argue it completely different, which is gravity. They didn't really, on the simple level, they didn't know about gravity. So if you wanted to, so Maimonides built a lot of his kind of proof about the nature of God, and that we can know God from the way the planetary, the systems, kind of what we now know is held into place by gravity. They didn't know about gravity. So what happens with all that is there's two options. One option is you throw it out the window and say, that's why we avoid tying Torah to science, because science is always changing. Torah can't really change, or not that much, at least. Changes in a different way than science. Science, we throw it out, and we throw out what we thought was science, and we embrace the new science. That's one way. That's why Maimonides was instantly condemned, because who wants to tie your horse to something that, like science, that's just going to change? Philosophy, that's just going to change. By the way, his science is also philosophy. So when we say science, I really mean science and philosophy. The other way is to adjust Maimonides. A lot of people who like not the exact things Maimonides says, but the attitude that Maimonides has, which is reconciling Torah with rationality, with science, philosophy. So what they would do is they would say something that Sir Isaac Newton would say when he discovered gravity. He didn't say, well, there goes the necessity of God running the world. Quite to the contrary, he said, only a perfect creator would have put everything, all the planets in the orbit they're in and the distance that they're at, for the things to work the way they do. So what he was essentially doing is saying, well, we now know that there's gravity, but that doesn't at all take away from God being the creator. So you could do kind of a, Isaac Newton reevaluation, but it wouldn't be the way Maimonides worded it in his Mishnah Torah or his Mar Nevuchim. here's the problem. It's almost like a farce, the stretch that he has to go to say that they were talking about physics and metaphysics, that Maisa Bereshis is physics. Again, Neoplatonic, Aristotelian physics. And Maisa Merkava is metaphysics. The amount of like fudging that he would have to do to take that from this chapter in the Talmud, and he almost basically says, nobody knew this except I came up with it. He admits it. I mean, in other words, he says it was forgotten, and I think this is what it is. You know, this is what makes sense to me. So he's not even claiming its authority from some ancient tradition that his teacher's teacher told him this is what it means. He had authority in halacha because he has a father, and his father was a student of the Ri Migash, who was a student of the Rif. So there was a shalshelis, there was kind of a chain of teacher, a student teacher, that he could claim some kind of halachic authority. Like honestly, my connection to halacha is, you know, through the Feinstein family, goes back to Moshe. And that's important to me because I want to know that if I'm going to, you know, preoccupy myself with halacha, that I'm connecting it to somebody of authority. So I have other teachers, but Moshe is a very significant figure. So the Rambam had that when it came to halacha in his day. He connected his stuff to the Rif and the Ri Migash through his father. But he didn't try to do anything like that when it came to this particular. He didn't try to tie his horse to anything in between the statements of the Talmud and his own reimagining, which he admits to having found, discovered, rediscovered the meaning of something that's meaning was lost. Now, it doesn't. I mean, it is possible to say and argue that this tradition has been lost. Nobody can figure out, this is what I think it is. And that's what he does. It's almost like basically saying that if the Zohar was written by Moshe de Leon and his contemporaries, it would be like saying, I think that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai would have written this. This is what I think he would have written, based on a tradition that was lost, and I came up with what I think it was. So arguably, and by the way, that's going to be number 5, is going to be that Kabbalah is my Merkava. Arguably, both Maimonides, which is number 3, that is physics, and number 5, which is its Kabbalah, are basically rediscovering an ancient tradition that was lost pretty much. They're just little fragments of it, okay? We'll come back to that because what we're gonna do is as we do the actual text in the Talmud, we'll talk about the weaknesses and the strengths of each of these arguments, okay? Number 4, and this is based primarily on the work of Rachel Elior. And she's not alone, but she's a significant thinker in this area, which is, in a way, the most exciting from a kind of historic perspective that's being buttressed by new findings and new understandings of the Qumran, what we call the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, what does this have to do with the Dead Sea Scrolls? Well, the answer is as follows. The answer is that what happened with the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls is that they were Jewish, but they had significant disagreements with the rabbis. And the theory is that they were a priestly class. They were Kohanim. Now, they had a form of displacement. Presumably, that family, if we were to assume that they were Bnei Tzadok, which might often be referred to in the Talmud as an amalgamation of groups under the rubric of the word Siddukim. But the Bnei Tzadok were in control of the temple from 1 to 100 years, let's say, in the second temple period. We know from the Talmud there was back and forth between the rabbinic supporting Kohanim Gedolim, high priests, and the non-rabbinic, the anti-rabbinic Kohanim Gedolim. So this would fill in and explain a lot of kind of loose ends in the Talmud would be tied together through this explanation. These Bnei Tzadok, let's say they were exiled when the Hashmonaim dynasty took over and controlled the temple after their victory against the Greeks. So these fellows decided they have to figure something out. So they looked to certain texts. Particular text they may have drawn a lot of inspiration was from the first chapter of Yecheskel. Why is the first chapter of Yecheskel so important to them? Because the first chapter of Yecheskel is about Yecheskel, who was a Kohen, by the way. And it's a vision specifically of him leaving Israel, so him being outside, like being an outsider. He's at this river on the way to the Castian, I guess somewhere around Babylon, whatever it is. And it's the only known recording, by the way, in the prophets of God appearing to a prophet that I know of, God appearing to a prophet outside of the land of Israel. And the Talmud picks up on it. The Talmud discusses if that was just because he had already had a previous prophecy in Israel, so he was able to kind of continue even outside of Israel, or that was an exception to the rule. But what he does envision is a projection of how the temple would be experienced in a space no longer in the temple, a temple in time, a temple in Chutzlars, outside of the Holy Land, but nevertheless, the sacred kind of experiences, the angelic elements that were supposed to be like woven into the fabric, literally, of, let's say, the Mishkan, like the kruvim on the paroches, or the kruvim chiseled into gold, out of gold on the Aron Habrit, on top of the Ark of the Covenant. So what you're talking about now is they drew inspiration from that type of work, and they continued in that genre. One of the things that distinguished them from the rabbis is that they kept writing. The rabbinic understanding was the Torah shebichtav, what they call the written Torah. That window had then been closed by that at the end of the Second Temple period. And now was the time of the oral Torah. So a lot of things make sense with her explanation of why they specifically didn't write down. They made such an effort to not write down. It would be so much easier they remembered things that must have been like so difficult to remember just because they wouldn't write it down. Now it makes more sense. So that's all part of the understanding that it was a Kohanic kind of concepts, that even though it didn't stay exclusively to the realm of the Kohanim eventually, what happened is there was some understanding that was good within that tradition, and there was some part of it that was tremendously dangerous, because the association with the Bnei Tzadok would mean that you're anti-rabbi. It would mean that you believe that the Torah, Shebichtav, the written Torah, continues. It would believe that you didn't have a lunar calendar that was only readjusted by adding a full leap month every few years, but rather it was a solar calendar, which is totally would change the face of the holidays and things like that, which they did argue about. So therefore, obviously, they didn't want to admit that there was anything good there, but they didn't want to deny its total existence. So what they did is they used these code words to say it's Ma'aser Bereishis, Ma'aser Merkava, whatever part of it was considered okay, was under watch and key, and could only be accessed by the greatest of the generation and given over to one person at a time, sometimes in a very cryptic way. So that's number 4. And there's a lot to say. And each one of these, each one of them is a series in and of itself. And number 5 it's Kabbalah. And people like, in other words, the claim of the Bahir, why is there this need to link the Bahir to Nechudim ben Akana? Why is there this need to link the Zohar with Arishon Bar Yochai? The simple answer is that because we believe that that's actually them. Or if it's not actually them, there's a Talmud that tells us if you want something to be accepted, tie it to, I think it says tie it to a tall tree, which is understood to mean, I mean, it's not advocating lying, but it kind of is saying like, if something is important, you know, say a great rabbi said it. So that would be kind of a limud schos of if it was written much later. And how could you explain why they would make up a story? The answer is they want it to be accepted. But the third way. The third way is it's not just that they wanted it to be accepted. This is what they felt. They were channeling what they consider, like the equivalent of Maimonides, although Maimonides is more honest. Maimonides says, this is what I think they meant. It's lost, we don't know, but this is what I think it is. I'm a scientist, a physicist, a rational thinker. Here's how it makes sense. The Balei HaZohar and the Balei HaBahir, the authors of the Zohar and the Bahir, if they weren't actually the Tanaim and Amoraim, they were people that were channeling what they considered Ma'aser Merkava and Ma'aser Bereishis. So that's number 5. Number 6 is it's not one because where are those brises? What happened to them? It's not 2 of Kabbalah Maasiyot because it isn't. It's not 3 because Maimonides, it's such a stretch, they don't have to even spend time refuting it. It's not 4 because, you know, what happened before Rachel Elior, nobody could figure this out, that it was the Bnei Tzadok. It's not 5 because Kabbalah came hundreds of years later. What is it? It's Talmud. It should be able to be understood from the context of other agadic teachings of the Talmud. And if you don't understand it, it's because it's sparse, because it really isn't revealed. Number 6 is very close to number 1, but it's saying it's not like there's some hidden Masechta. By the way, there are concepts of hidden Masechtas and Masechtas that were lost. For sure. I mean, whatever we have might be 5% or 10% of what is. There's traditions that there were 600 or 700 Masechtot of Mishnayos. I'm not saying that's not an exaggeration, but to think that we have, you know, many fewer tractors of that, to think that we've got everything, you know, it's a stretch to think that. So it could be that number 6 and number 1 are very closely interconnected. And number 6 is basically we have to really do a better analysis of agadic tradition in the Talmud and see how much of that could be kind of put closer to what we could consider Ma'aser Bereishis, Ma'aser Merkava. In other words, very few people have really looked into this. And so number 1 and number 6 are almost the same, but there's some subtle differences. And number 7 is basically, it could be, it's not like none of the above is true. It's like all of the above. Like there's no reason to limit. It could be that there's some elements that were taught in Brises. And then another thing is that it was magic and it influenced, not so much that we know that it was all these things and everything Maimonides writes in Mar Nebuchim and everything that the Zohar says are both coming clearly from a tradition of Ma'aser Merkava and Ma'aser Bereishis, but it's that these elements that were in Ma'aser Bereishis, Ma'aser Merkava influence all of the other things that came that we're talking about, all the other categories. So those are the 7 kind of, that's the introduction of how to even begin to read this section of the Gemara. Any questions on that before we actually go into the Gemara? You could put it in the chat if you don't want to speak. Anybody have any questions? Okay, you guys just send me a question in the chat. You don't have to, if you, or you can speak, but or if you want, we'll just go right into the Talmud, and then you can just, ask me when we're actually studying the section in the Talmud. You could ask me questions.
What is the section in the Talmud?
It's the second chapter of Chagiga, Ein Darshan, 11b, because there's a link that Zev posted in the chat.
Oh, okay, I got it.
Or you can just go there directly. Thank you, Ben. Somebody asked a question. Finally.
It's the silly question ever, but I figured.
It's a good reminder. Okay.
My question really there was mysticism behind my question.
I'm
I just
sure.
gave it over in the simple.
For sure. Okay, so let's take a look. So, like I said, there's 4.5, there's, double-sided folio pages. So if you're looking in the art scroll, it's probably going to be something like, 25 pages or something, 20 pages. So we're not going to go through 20 pages of material right now. A, we don't have time, and B, we don't really even need to do all of it. So the topic is Ein Darshan. Ein Darshan means we don't teach, meaning we don't even teach. Not even one person can sit on their own and study Maisa Merkava, or one student can study Maisa Bereshis if they're not on the level. So it's Ein Darshan Barayat B'Shosha V'Lo Maisa Bereshit B'Shnayim V'Lo Merkava B'Yachid. Elim Ken Haya Chacham U'Mevi Midaito. This is towards the top of the page, unless the person is wise and has their own understanding. And then the Mishnah says, Kol mistakel ba'arba dvarim, and the Talmud explains, like, what are we talking about? Like, how many people? 3 people, including the teacher, excluding the teacher, when it comes to certain hidden elements of what was sexually not allowed, that weren't obvious. And we're not going to talk about that, but it's interesting. I'll talk about that on Shabbos. And Maisa Bereshis with 2, and the Merkava with 1, which might even mean just you on your own, unless you have these qualifications. And then it continues called if you inquire or look at these 4 things, it would be better if you weren't created. What are they? What's above, what's below? And Rashi, for example, says, what's above the heaven above the Chayot HaKodesh, the holy type of angel that's talked about in the Maaseh Merkava, the first chapter of Yechaskel. And what's below that? It could either be directional, or time-wise. Could either be what's if you travel to the end of the universe as far east as you could, or as far west, what would happen then? What would you see then? Kind of like, like there's a known universe, by the way. Even now, there's this thing, it's an expanding universe, but what about after that? What's going on there, right? Or Malafni Malacha is not talking about space, it's talking about time. What happened before creation, for example? That the Talmud will say, what's before? What's wrong? What's the issue with knowing what happened before? And then it says, and somebody who doesn't have proper respect for the Creator, better they shouldn't have been born. Okay, so we're going to skip to the bottom of the page. And the first thing the Gemara says, about 7 lines from the bottom, is how do we know that you can't teach with 2 people present which means including the teacher, according to what the Gemara said. If you're not on the certain level, how do we know this thing? In Tana Rabbanan, there's a brisa that says, it quotes the verse, if you inquire, but it's yachid, it's a singular word, individual shoel, one person can inquire, but two cannot. I might think you could talk about before creation. No, the verse says from when God created the world. It actually says and Adam on it. So since it mentions Adam, maybe we can only begin to talk about creation of man and not before that. What about the other 6 days or the 5 days leading into the beginning of the 6th day as well, before Adam and Eve were created? What about that? To the earlier days, then it would include this all 6 days of creation. I would think you could talk about what's above, what's below, what's before, what's after, or this way or that way. From one end of heaven to the other. In other words, within the context of what we know of space, physical or spiritual, meaning even if we learn that the space is not just physical space, it's talking about heavenly space. But within that parameters, you can discuss. You can't ask what's above, what's below, what's before, what's after. So if you took, let's say, pick a number of the 7. Let's really focus on 1 through 5. Pick a number, and let's go and understand the Talmud according to that way. Number 1 is that it's a brisa. Number 2, that it's Kabbalah Masiot. Number 3, it's just physics, like the Rambam. Number 4, it's like the B'nai Tzadok. And number 5, it's Kabbalah. Pick a number here. David Newton, pick a number.
I don't know if David is on the call. Oh, he is.
No, he's on it, but Zev, pick a number.
3.
Five.
What did David pick a number?
I said 3, but I don't care.
Okay. So we'll do 3 and we'll do 5. 3 is its physics, right? Okay, if you want to understand physics, you don't talk about what happened before the Big Bang, and don't talk about what's going to happen afterwards. Just like stick to here's the properties after the Big Bang, or whatever the equivalent of what we know of creation is. That's what we could talk about.
And I think they even say that time itself unfolds from the Big Bang. So the idea of before the Big Bang within that theory doesn't even make sense, because that's when time starts. There's no before if you don't have time.
Yeah. I mean, of course they are talking. Don't worry, there are physicists today that are very much talking about what happened before, and they want to know if this is just one of many universes and so on. Don't waste your time with that type of physics. You're gonna, it's weirder than even religion. That what's going on now. Okay, so now let's do number 5. It's Kabbalah. So that would work better with what's above or below if it was in terms of the angels. So that would mean, like, for example, in Kabbalah, we say that you should focus on certain olamot, certain worlds, and above certain other levels, let's say Atika Kadisha, don't preoccupy yourself with it. It's above your pay grade. You're just going to get lost over there. What's below, maybe that's that's the klipot that you could even study about. Don't be obsessed with that. What came before, meaning we could talk about God as he manifests as the creator into Bereshis. Before that, there was one, but there's nothing to talk about there. One is one. We don't have to talk about is there any parts of Sefirot in God before he was a God of creator. Leave that aside. It's not relevant. So that's how you would study. That's how you'd read that text with that in mind. Okay. Now,
can I just throw in there that when I read Chacham maybe Midasa Dato, I just think Chachma Bina Dat.
Mhm.
I can't help but just like, okay, if you have Chachma being at that, now you can have Maaseh Merkava. I know I'm reading that back in, but like that's the
Yeah, okay. So let's say we go with the Kabbalah one. And now let's ask a question. Why, it's a very practical question. Why is everybody studying Kabbalah? Not everyone. There's still Litvaks and there's still fine Jews from Yemen who don't believe in Kabbalah. Some of them do, some of them don't. I can't keep track or don't believe in certain Sifrei Kabbalah. And Litvaks believe in Sifrei Kabbalah, but don't think it's like, for the most part, that it's shaykh to them. They think it's like off limits. It's not for them. They have to be. There's a few of them that they'll learn it for the rest of us. So what's with Chabad? So that would actually explain a few things. Why it was so controversial for the Baal Shem Tov and the Alter Rebbe to do what they did, because they were going against what the Mishnah tells them not to do. They were Darish. Now, how would they justify it? They actually needed a heter in their own minds. They needed permission. So in the Chabad tradition, there's these like stories of how they understood that the world, yes, it was forbidden, and now it's permitted because the world is so spiritually ill that if we don't do this, the world is just going to, implode on itself. So it was almost like it was almost like, yeah, we know it's wrong, but the alternative is worse, so we're going to do this. It's the time. Okay, so there's going to have to be answers in Kabbalah to justify the revelation of Kabbalah. So certain Kabbalists, like the Ramak, are gonna write books to answer this question, basically, of why it's allowed, why it's even necessary, or they'll make distinctions and say there is a part of Kabbalah that's for advanced learners, and that you can't get that just by writing it down. That has to be transmitted. So once you write something down, it's not the true revelation. It's a further concealment. That's part of Kabbalah, is that by writing it, they're concealing it. The Megala Tefach Mechasat Tefachayim, which means they're revealing one hand breath, and they're concealing two hand breaths. They're doubling the concealment. So it's not just a revelation, it's also concealment. So there's all these kind of Kabbalistic terms, Kabbalistic concepts that address this question. There's not a really uniform way of addressing it. Each Kabbalist has their way of dealing with, by saying either this thing is Yodei Lamavinim, they'll say, for example, or Yodei Achen, which are those who understand, right? Like you said, Zev, like Maven Midaito. So there's expressions saying, we're not going to explain this. Those who know, right? And those who are familiar, students of the Kabbalah, they'll understand it. So there's certain elements that remain in place, and certain things that were either purposely allowed because of a particular necessity that necessitated it. Okay. Now the Rambam, which is number 3, back to you, Ted. Thank you, Ted, and Zev, because actually 2 is better than 1. We're comparing this same little section for 2 of these 5. We take Maimonides and says, why can't you study physics? Everyone studies. Anybody goes to high school today studies some physics. Is that why some Satmar yeshivas don't do advanced, secular studies? Because they're afraid of the Ram. They don't even hold from the Rambam here. So what's the issue? So the issue is like this. Maimonides is actually correct in his own circular reasoning, which is, if you study Maimonides' own work and reinterpreting Genesis, reinterpreting Yecheskel, if you're not very mature and you haven't really committed yourself to understanding the Torah as a whole before that, you will probably have major doubts in Emunah. There's no question that studying the Guide to the Perplexed is much more troubling for people to continue to have faith in God and mitzvot than the Zohar, for example. Can't compare the two. So while the Zohar, people have to make up stories that you're going to go crazy. 10, 15-year-old studies the Zohar, he's going to be Meshuggah. It's not like we know people. I mean, we always hear somebody has somebody they knew that went crazy, but generally it's not really, people are not going crazy unless they're already crazy from studying Kabbalah. Unless they're studying really whacked out stuff and trying it at home, and they shouldn't be. So in that sense, the Rambam makes even more sense than the claim that it's Kabbalah in terms of being careful not to study it.
I really disagree with you, Rabbi,
You tell me why, David.
because I think the process is when you open yourself up to this stuff, you get, it's called Kabbalah for a reason. And the reason is because you have to be you have to be prepared to receive. And the reception is one thing, the external thing of actually studying text and, understanding it, from where we are. But there's another side to where, just like in the case of Joseph Caro, that something within you, okay, godlike or something else comes alive. And those who can deal with it because they've perfected themselves. And those who can't deal with it go through, a process where, something unholy can be enjoined to them. And so I think the actual process is you open yourself up to this process. And so, all of a sudden, you get Joseph Caro, hearing voices if you're Joseph Caro and, giving forth of the Mishnah on the night of Shavuos is one thing. But then if you are somebody who is very clouded and confused in life, and all of a sudden you start hearing voices and, sort of all sorts of auditory or other types of hallucinations, it potentially can be very, very dangerous. And I think that, this is what it means, what it means to receive. On one level, yes, it's an existential thing of the practitioners, one group giving it down to another, to generation, but it's also something a little bit otherworldly coming alive within inside of you.
Beautiful,
But
David.
I can't prove, I don't mean it to be beautiful, Rabbi. I think it's an area which is, this is what they're trying to warn you about.
So what David is saying is there is some element of Kabbalah that an immature person having a mystical experience might blow their mind, and not necessarily in a good way. Like Rabbi Yosef Karo, he's the author of the Shulchan Aruch and an even bigger work called the Beis Yosef. Fine, he had this magid, he had this experience. It's like almost like I don't want to call it possession, but it's kind of like a positive being that would enter into him and speak through him. Okay, great. But the regular people having something like that, you'd send them to the psych ward. So yeah, it's true. That's more, I think, like the number two, like the Kabbalah Maisiot, meaning the people who are trying to get into some induced state of experiencing some form of prophecy or doing some type of magic. I would agree with you, David, that that's very dangerous, and you can't do that without being fully ready and having a guide that's on the level to take you there, etc. So I would agree. I'm more thinking like from a practical thing. I like Chabad Hasidus. I like the Zohar. I like the Ari, and or of course the Ishbitzer, stuff like that. Like, so it's more thinking Hasidus than ecstatic magical Kabbalah, But I'd agree with you that yes, if you found certain parts and trying to do certain things, it could be dangerous.
If Kabbalah, let's say, assume for a second, I guess the definition of Kabbalah, and it isn't the definition necessarily, is like how things work, like for real, like north to south, east to west, an MR, like really the way things work. And let's say just analogously, you would have 100 people who work at companies, and you would reveal to them who they are in the stack, like in the organizational structure. How many of those people wouldn't go meshuggah when they realized that they were actually, something very insignificant? Or another possibility is, let's say you would tell those 100 people the compensation, the payroll of everyone in the organization, and it turns out that their compensation is really not good. It's really below everyone else's. So those are like, I think a lot of people would go out of their minds, so to speak, if they learned about these very real truths that degraded, demoted, diluted, like really didn't put them on the pedestal that they had fictitiously, artificially, and maybe for good reason had believed they were on because they didn't know any better. So maybe that's, I mean, it's in some sense like Kabbalah it might just be information that could create some uncomfortability with a lot of our assumptions about stuff, like the most basic stuff, like who we are or what our standing is or where we stand in relation, not just absolutely, but maybe in relation to other things. No?
And you're saying this specifically like the Rambam's version, right? Like it was saying, like you're understanding what the reality also has to be hidden.
Yeah, the
You know what I
real
mean?
reality and real reality. Like there's always like more, like, do I need to know my laptop every single sort of fun? Like if I knew how it actually worked, I'd go out of my mind. Like if my camera doesn't work on my laptop. If I drilled into the folders and files, I mean, it was like, it blew my mind. Like I had no way of fixing it. So it's not fixed because I didn't bother bringing it to someone who understands, I don't know, the drivers, so to speak. And, I could decouple that and re-upload that and blah, blah, blah. It just became, it was voluminous. It was window after window after window, and it just drowned me. So I was like, wow, I was amazed. I actually said, oh, like this is God. Like God actually
That's what they'd like you to think.
No, not that they're God, but you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
this, just my stupid little camera.
More than you can handle. I mean, look, that's a great explanation, is that any time there's something that's more than you can handle, it's not healthy. So like, even if you're studying Talmud, there's a methodology where they say, study it in a way where it's compact and then get that in its compact form. So you got that before you expand it,
But that's the one little footnote. When I was thinking about it, the Talmud, when you're studying Gemara, the advantage of that is that you're in battle, so to speak, with the text. There's a certain parity between you and the text. Kabbalah, when you're studying it, it's like sort of like take it or like learn it, love it, or leave it. But more like if you learn it and you don't learn it well enough to love it, it's leave it means actually you're done. You're sort of like, in a way, it's much more like you just need, it is. And so you're studying it, but I don't think it's like as much of like you technically, like for real, like we don't analyze.
You're not in the conversation as
You're
much
not
as
a part.
a Talmud.
Yeah, you're not a party to the party.
Well, getting back to Masa Merkava, to have this be such an important reference, it's, Shavuot, for instance, if nothing else, and to say, okay, well, here's all this stuff, and we don't have to understand it. It'll be way better to just study, Vayikra. Let's just talk about animal sacrifices, something we can, really get a grip on. This animal, this cut, this sacrifice, that sacrifice. That's Judaism, really. Don't deal with these other things. Don't deal with revelation at Sinai. It's too hard for us to understand. Seeing voices and hearing, So I think that's why this is so central. And without that, it's just folkways.
Well, you're a big advocate of number 7, which is all of the above. Like all philosophy, of Jewish philosophy, all of Kabbalah, all of include a little bit of Jewish studies from these kind of lost lore that may have influenced us and so on, and reevaluate Talmud, reevaluate the stories in the Talmud, because one of the things a lot of people don't understand is there is tremendous amount of spiritual knowledge in the Talmud, and it's just ignored. It's just like soundly and roundly ignored and not given attention. It's going to make a little bit of a comeback because now you've got like hundreds of thousands of people either studying the Daf Yomi or watching it on TikTok or some variation of it, because it's becoming, we got to put a little credit to Rabbi Steinsaltz and the Art Scroll and the Daf Yomi committee, Rabbi Shapiro from Chachmei Lublin, who instituted it, and the people who kept it going even when it wasn't popular. And now, boom, and so now we're going to get this learned, people, and some of those people are spiritual, and they're not going to just keep skimming over the Agadata. And that's what one of my things is let's take a better look at the Agadata.
One thing that hits me, something that I know because you pointed out that the rabbis are really constantly concerned with kavod. It strikes me that kavod is like a spiritual concept, that everything should have its proper order in the world as a way of like ultimately lining everything up in a correct way of serving. I don't know. There seems to be something deeply spiritual about this idea of kavod as they're playing with it. And it even like, it's not just the Agadata at that point. Then it gets into the halacha as well, like what the point of understanding through halachic analysis how to give kavod. Like, I don't know, it really binds it all together. And it does seem at that point that the halacha is also a spiritual exercise.
Yeah. Yeah, and we'll look, we're definitely going to have to spend, I'm happy to do 2 more in this series of Talmud and kind of mysticism within the Talmud. So we could do another one that's very related to this about the 4 that entered the partis. Then we could just do one on kind of like mystical things within the Talmud above and beyond this, because people think this is it. It is totally not it. This is totally not it. So for example, I'll give you one example. If you look at brachot, right? Brachot 51a in brachot says the following thing. There's a story, and I'm studying brachot, and I just studied this, and I paid almost no attention to it. And I'm the one claiming that I do pay attention to this, and I didn't. So you could imagine everyone else who doesn't even make those claims, they definitely don't notice these things, okay? So here's what it says. It says, it's talking about this asparagus. And this asparagus is this weird drink that has some mystical element to it. Don't ask me what it is. That's not relevant because that's why I didn't pay any attention. As soon as I started learning about this drink, that's like dangerous if you drink it like this, I'm like, I don't care about it. So I tuned out. But guess what I missed in my tuning out? This is what I missed. So the Talmud says, Amar Rabbi Shmuel ben Elisha. David Newton, you listening to your Rabbi Shmuel? Rabbi Shmuel ben Elisha said, now who's Rabbi Shmuel? He was the Kohen Gadol. And he also says, in brachot, I think it's on 14 or something like that. Amar Rabbi Shmuel ben Elisha, Pamachas nechdasti lahaktir ketoras lefnai lefnim. V'isi sakasriel Hashem tzar tzvakot shu yoshev al kisei ram benisa. V'amar li, you know how I know this by heart? Because not because I know any Talmud by heart. It's Avram Fried sings this song. It's a great song. V'amar li Yishmael b'ni, Yishmael b'ni, I b'ni, I b'ni, I b'ni, I bohu barcheni, amarti lo, yatzei milfanecha, shich b'shu, rachamecha eskascha v'yigoylu yachmecha amidei secha. It's been a while. I might have forgotten some of the words, but basically, Rabbi Shmuel ben Elisha went into the temple. It goes into the Holy of Holies, and he sees Akasriel. Akasriel is a name either of God or an angel, but here it identifies it with Hashem, with God, Sartzvaos. And he's sitting on a kisei, a lofty throne. And he says to me, me, Ishmael, give me a blessing. And I give him a blessing to God. May it be his will that his anger be overcome by his compassion. His compassion should overwhelm his anger. And he should act with us towards his children with compassion. So it's the same Elisha, I'm sorry, not Elisha, Yishmael ben Elisha. There's a connection to Elisha ben Avuya, not related to this Elisha that just had the same name. So he says the following. Three things surreal, because he would interact with these angels, who was the angel of the interior ministry. Surreal is mentioned here in our Talmud as the one who's like taller than everyone else, like hundreds of whatever years travel distance to get from his to his height. And he's putting crowns on God's head. So much so that the Gemara is bothered by it and says, how could he put, I thought nobody can reach where God is. And it says, well, he would make the crowns would just kind of go up and go onto God's head. So he says, don't take your shirt from your butler, in the morning when you're getting dressed, like just take it from the closet on your own. Don't have the guy put it on you. Again, what is that, David? Magic. And the same thing when you're washing your hands, don't have somebody else wash your hands who hasn't washed their hands. And when you have this cup of asparagus, don't give it back to somebody who didn't give it to you. That's why I didn't pay any attention. Like, who cares about this asparagus cup? It's magic. We don't do it. It's irrelevant, right? Rabbi Yossi, am I right for ignoring it?
I wouldn't say it's irrelevant.
I would think it's irrelevant. I thought it was irrelevant. I don't have a butler, and I've never drunk this asparagus, and nobody's washing my hands in the Til Sidam in the morning anyway. So it's irrelevant. Two of the three, I mean, and it's magic. It's magic. Okay, comes Rashi and says, what's going on here? Rashi Dibra HaMaschil, it's a little further, the same section. So he says, Rabbi Yishmael Allah l'rakia ayidei shame, the Brisa. What's going on here? This Rabbi Yishmael, he went up into heaven through a divine name. And here's the kicker. Here's what's most important. The Brisa de Maisa Merkava. In the Brisa of Maisa Merkava, what is Rashi saying? There's a Brisa or Brisot, plural. There's a section of the equivalent of what we call the Mishnah is the Brisa, huge amount of teachings. They weren't recorded in the Mishnayot for whatever the reason is. There were too many of them. Maybe not everything could be included in the Mishnah. And part of the whole project of the Talmud is reconciling Brises with the Mishnah when possible. And that's for another time, the place of the Brisa within the context of Gemara versus the Mishnah. Bottom line is what? What does Rashi tell us? Rashi is telling us, you want to know Maisa Merkava? It's a place you go, but you got to know the text. It's text-based. And now where is it now? It's lost. I looked it up. I couldn't find it. I mean, again, maybe there's other sections of the Talmud, arguably, we could reconstruct these midrashim from Medrash, from Agadita. That's the claim of I made in number 6. That keeps studying Talmud. We'll piece this back together. Stop looking in the Zohar, stop looking at the Rambam. That's not what it is. It's Talmud itself. But number 1 is basically it's not even Talmud. It's a lost tradition, basically.
Right, and there's that whole thing. I mean, they mention that over and over in the Zohar. It's this book mentions this book or that book or this book
that we don't know about now.
Yeah, which may have existed or was often thought was lost over time. So there was, if you want, revealed texts that are now not revealed. They're lost. They exist in this almost Platonic sphere. They exist, but we can't access them.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is here we could look up these like we just learned 2 stories about one person, Rabbi Yishmael. There's other stories. He's also featured in our section in the 2nd chapter of Chagiga as well. So here we go. We're going to reconstruct these kind of Brysos teachings of these early rabbinic figures, these Tanaim, and let's see what we can get. That story with him going into the Holy of Holies and seeing Akasriel Hashem Sartzvakot, which is either a name of God or an angel and God. I mean, or a whole nother complicated situation there. Right. And then that's part of a bigger section of the Talmud, which is that God and us have like these kind of human interactions in the sense of God, like Moses's arguments with God take on real meaning in the Talmud. And that becomes something that is not just the tzaddikim or the Melech Oleshensk and 18th century and 19th century, where the Hasidic Rebbe's started taking on this power to change God's mind, so to speak. This is in the Talmud. It starts with Moses and goes into Hanina ben Dosa and people like that. So did they do it through Shemot, or did they do it just by a Choni Hamagal style, making a circle around them and saying, I'm not going out of the circle till it rains? Anyway, something to think about, and welcome to chapter 2 of Chagiga, which is really, fascinating. I'm so glad we're able to do this.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Rip.